It was supposed to be a quiet evening, a casual get-together at Greg and Clara's place, just a few drinks, some appetizers, a little small talk. You know, the kind of evening that doesn't end with anyone having to call the police or burn a couch. But, of course, that's not how things went. Clara had gone all out. She spent the whole week perfecting her signature dish, spicy lasagna surprise. Greg wasn't sure what the surprise was, but Clara insisted it was a new twist on an old recipe. Greg wasn't much of a cook, but he was very good at pretending to enjoy food. The guests trickled in around 7 p.m. First was Mark, Clara's cousin. He was always a bit too eager to talk about his latest diet fad. Then came Karen and Ted, who seemed to be stuck in a perpetual state of pretending they liked each other. Finally, there was Steve, Greg's childhood friend who had recently taken up yoga. Steve insisted he felt energetically aligned after each session, but Greg suspected Steve was just trying to dodge actual work. The lasagna was placed in the center of the table, steaming with a savory scent that didn't quite sit right with Greg. But hey, Clara was excited, so who was he to say anything? He forced a smile and dug in. Around the second bite, Mark started to cough, hard, his face turning a strange shade of red. Ted slapped his back, probably a bit too enthusiastically, considering Mark was already choking. Meanwhile, Karen was still calmly cutting her lasagna, oblivious to the impending chaos. Mark, are you okay? Mark, I think it's in my throat. Before he could finish, he fell forward, face first, into the lasagna. Everyone gasped. Clara, call an ambulance! But no one moved. Greg didn't know why. Maybe it was because the whole thing was so absurd, or maybe because Mark, in his state of apparent distress, still managed to look like he was trying to reach for the last piece of garlic bread. By the time Mark was pulled from the table, his face was as flat as the lasagna he'd been devouring. The room fell silent. But then, Steve spoke up. Steve, yeah, that's the thing with Clara's cooking. She's really into, experimental flavors. Ted, Clara, what did you put in that lasagna? Clara, I don't know. I just followed the recipe. It's just ricotta, tomato, herbs, a dash of cayenne. Greg, cayenne, is that the surprise? Did you forget to check if it was actually cayenne, or did you just go for the ghost pepper seasoning you found in the back of the pantry? Clara, I thought it was just a joke seasoning. It's not, is it? By now, Mark was definitely not going to make it to dessert. His body lay still, and the other guests, Ted and Karen, were either too stunned to move or too in denial to react. But it wasn't until Steve, Yoga Steve, stood up and casually brushed his pants that things took a turn for the worse. Steve, maybe I should go. Suddenly, there was a loud crunch from under the table. A noise so unnatural it felt like something was being chewed. But not in the way a person would chew food. It was almost like the lasagna itself was consuming something. Clara, did you hear that? Greg, yeah, I heard that. They slowly looked under the table. What they saw was not what any of them expected. Mark was back on his feet, only he wasn't Mark anymore. His skin had taken on a sickly grayish hue, and his eyes were no longer wide in panic but glazed over, blank and almost hungry. He had become a twisted, grotesque version of himself, his body twitching unnaturally. His mouth was open, impossibly wide. He was chewing. Mark, I'm so hungry. Before anyone could scream, Mark lunged for the lasagna, his arms snapping forward with terrifying speed. The room erupted into chaos. The last thing Greg saw before everything went black was Steve, calmly retreating into a yoga pose, murmuring something about finding balance in the chaos, just as a bloody hand grabbed his ankle.